Hello, ladies and gentlemen, dear esteemed viewers of Civ Space TV. This is yet another episode of this Youth Roundtable, and with me here is a panel of distinguished ladies and gentlemen that is going to help us discuss a topic that has become very commonplace, and that is climate change. But for today's discussion, we shall look at it from the perspective of the youth. What does this have to do with the youth? Should the youth be worried like the rest of the world? We are seeing some youths taking the lead in this. Is that the right step to go? But before I go any further, I am Godwin Toko, your new host for this show. I take over from Mr. Matanda, who has been moderating this show for such a long time. We thank him for his services, and for that, in that regard, I'll have him introduce himself, and we have the introductions in that order.
Yes, thank you very much, Toko. It feels nice not having the pressure of moderating, being on this side of the show. Like you said, my name is Matanda Abubaker, and I'm a former youth leader and a happy former moderator of the Youth Roundtable. I know we are going to have a good conversation.
Hi, everyone. I am Mirriam Lawoko. I am a law student at Cavendish University, and I'm so glad to be a part of this panel discussing something that's so important like climate change. So thank you for having me.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Henry Otafiire. I work with the Great Lakes Institute for Strategic Studies as a research fellow, and I also used to be a former climate change activist.
Hey everyone, I'm Ayoo Molly. I'm a final year student at Makerere University, pursuing a bachelor's degree in environmental sciences. I'm so passionate about climate change, so I'm happy to be on this platform. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those introductions. Now, without further ado, let's get into the gist of these discussions. So we all hear of climate change. We've all come across this word multiple times. A couple of weeks back, in fact, currently, there's a conference going on in Glasgow that has brought together world leaders to discuss this very issue called climate change. There are those that seem to say it's more than meets the eye, and they're calling upon us to run away, if I'm to use Matanda's words, to get scared and to be proactive and act right now. But there are those that seem to drag their feet. There are those who are also accused of speaking the niceties and failing to act. So we are going to put all this in perspective, but before we start from there, I'll just ask that we have the person who has done some pretty much work with climate change, Molly, to introduce for us. Molly, what do you understand by climate change? What is the gist of the matter when they say climate change? What should come to people's minds?
When someone talks of climate change, we are talking about the sustained increase or variation from the normal temperatures. Most times it is sustained for above or about 30 years. So it's different from when you talk about weather or climate. Climate variability has to be sustained, and we see that with the increase in average global temperatures since the pre-industrial time, before we had industrial revolution. So that means there is a contribution from the human activities that has increased what we call the greenhouse effect. Something that happens in the atmosphere when greenhouse gases react. So human being is just contributing so much that there is an anthropogenic or human effect. So it has made the process exaggerated, that we feel the impacts, and that we call it climate change. So it always presents itself in various ways, but here in Uganda, we always see it with two extreme events. Those are the extreme droughts, prolonged dry seasons, and always more intense rainfalls than they used to be. I think I can leave it as brief as that.
Okay, thank you. Otafiire, you've listened to that very elaborate definition. I think she has really made your work easy. So I'm going to ask, in your own perspective as a research fellow at GLISS, what does climate change mean for a country like Uganda? How should we view it as Ugandans under the current circumstances?
Thank you, Toko. I think she has done justice to defining what the concept of climate change is about. Regarding your question, I think Uganda, just like the rest of African countries, have been recruited into a debate where we have little bargaining power, and the global north enjoys leverage in pushing an agenda which perhaps we can say doesn't put our interest as a country at heart. I can explain. We know we discovered oil in 2006, and there have been serious activities around exploration, production. Now we are almost at the phase of production. And recently you had a campaign by about 38 civil society organizations which were opposing the eco project. It's not environment friendly. It is we are abating fossil fuels. So as a Ugandan, I think it becomes unfair if you're told that stop your oil production, which is in a range of 2.5 billion barrels, when you're told that you immediately stop utilizing your natural resource, which has potential to transform your country from a backward to an industrialized or modern country. So for me as a Ugandan, that debate hurts me, and I feel even at the international level, just like other African countries, that debate we have been co-opted. We have been cropped up from that debate on how do we advance our interests in the grand scheme of things.
Okay, let me pick it up from there. So the demonstrations against ECOM, we saw them even in South Africa at Standard Bank, which is funding the project, the Stanbic Bank. So is this a question of them saying that, okay, you can mine your oil, but use a more environmentally friendly method and not go for the most crude method? That you see, the issue is also about human rights, the evictions that are going to happen, the pressure on the land, and then the aspect of the mining. So are they saying we shouldn't mine the oil? Are they saying we should mine the oil in a manner that is more sustainable to the survival of the environment?
That debate started in 1992. I think it was around Kyoto Protocol, which is, I think, one of the original climate change agreements. The low-income countries pushed an agenda that they have a right to development. And that right to development was saying we can utilize our natural resources in a manner that's sustainable. So we strike a balance between utilizing our natural resources without hurting the environment. And when it goes to the global level, from the West point of view, it's marks of hypocrisy, because they are saying you stop exploiting the natural resources, the fossil fuels. I think there is a movement in the global north. It's called divestiture. They are pushing companies, foundations, governments stop funding projects to do with the fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. But wait a minute, these countries got where they are now because they were using that energy, which they are saying we cannot use overnight now. So for me, it is hypocrisy. And I think as a country and as a continent, we need to have that debate.
Mimi, do you view it in the same? Is it a case of hypocrisy? Is it a case of genuine concern that the environment, the world, which is our only home, is heating up, is getting burnt, and we therefore need to be proactive as the human species?
You know what? I think it's a very interesting topic because you have different views, like Henry just said. I think climate change is actually very real. We can see the long-term effects of it. I think the reason why people have a belief that it's a myth and it's an agenda that the West is pushing to stop developing countries from basically developing their industries is because they don't get it. When we look at our weather patterns, I lived in a country that was below sea level in the Netherlands, and they have had floods over the years. And in Uganda, I think because we don't see the immediate effect, people think it's a myth. And another reason is why people don't understand climate change is because they don't have an education about it. They're not seeing the short-term effects, therefore they dismiss it as an agenda that the West doesn't want Africa to develop, or they don't want to see a certain growth of industry in developing countries. I actually disagree with that because we actually see the number of floods that have been taking place around the world, droughts, people not having the right weather conditions. So we cannot ignore the fact, yes, I'm pretty sure that, like Henry said, there might be agenda behind it. Then how do we dismiss the fact that our climate is changing, the weather patterns are changing? There is there's continuous floods out there. There's droughts taking place. We can't just ignore it and say, you know what, the West is pushing an agenda to stop Africa from developing. Then how do we explain the shift in weather patterns? You see, I'm not an expert on climate change, but I have to call it like it is because I see it happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to Mr. Matanda Abubaker. Mr. Matanda, when you see what we saw or what we are seeing now happening in Glasgow, we know that there have been many of these conferences that organized by the UN, organized by international bodies to discuss climate change and to call upon the world to drum up support and say, let's act. There are resolutions of UN, countries have pledged to act, yet there's a lot of foot dragging. Very few of them, if any, are acting. What makes it really hard for people to appreciate that, hey, there's a problem, let's all act? Why is there that intransigence?
Yeah, thank you very much. The fact is that climate change is a very complex issue to approach, and it's partly what she has explained. Many people struggle to see how climate change is a bread and butter issue, how climate change relates to their day-to-day lives. And because just like she defined it, when you're talking about climate change, you're talking about change in weather patterns over a long period of time. And as human beings, we struggle with seeing and dealing with things that take a long period of time. And some people say that when you see a person struggling with weight, it does not mean they had a heavy dinner the previous night. It's things that are incremental. Human beings struggle with dealing with them because they don't see them happening. But more than that, it's actually interesting. Ironically, you know the way the conversation had been structured by Henry, you'd think that it's only less developed countries that have a struggle with this conversation. But I can tell you that even the developed countries still want to produce, and their economies still have needs and they need to grow. And all those who are interested in that growth and development are opposed to some of the suggestions that come from those who are saying, look, we are facing an existential threat. If we continue emitting these greenhouse gases the way we are doing, we are going to find ourselves wiped off the face of the earth. And there are patterns to show what has been happening from the 1800s through the early 1900s up to where we are now. And so, to answer your question directly, why commitments are hard to meet? For example, when they last met in Paris in 2015, these countries made a commitment to every year raise at least 100 billion US dollars to invest in matters climate change. Unfortunately, nothing of the sort has happened. In fact, there are studies now that show that banks across the world have lent out over 3 trillion US dollars to companies that are facilitating emission or with projects that actually lead to emission of greenhouse gases. So I think what makes that conversation difficult, in summation, is one, the struggle for human beings to understand threats that happen over a long period of time, but two, the inherent contradiction in saying that you want to reduce emission of greenhouse gases, which in effect means you want to reduce production, because we have not been very successful, at least so far, in coming up with very efficient alternatives of production that do not require burning of fossil fuels.
Okay, let's get back to Molly. Molly, you've mentioned, Matanda has mentioned, Otafiire has mentioned, and even Mimi has mentioned the aspect of greenhouse gases and how these things affect climate change. But if we see floods in Kampala, we know that Kampala's population has grown exponentially over the last 10 or 20 years. We know that more than ever, people are dropping plastic water bottles, plastic polythene bags into the channels. And without any science, we know that once these channels are blocked, there are going to be floods. When you talk of the heating, we know that there's been a lot of, because electricity and gas in Uganda is a bit costly, people resort to to charcoal as their means of cooking. So trees are cut to facilitate that. And if trees are cut, there's going to be deforestation that is going to interrupt the rain cycle and that is going to cause the heat. Is Uganda's side, are the effects, how do we relate Uganda's negative effects directly to climate change? And pick that away and say, instead of holding the man that is throwing the bottle in Nachivo Channel, we say, oh, this has got to do with someone who is driving a car somewhere in Korea that then emits greenhouse gases. How do we relate to this? wouldn't it be fairer to say that this is a Ugandan thing? Let's address it from the Ugandan level.
Thank you so much. I think if you want to relate directly these two extreme events that I've talked about, the more intense rainfalls and the prolonged droughts, you can actually do that. But to start with what you said, that you think the floods in Kampala is because of people blocking the drainages, that is one. Because these things happen as a myriad of reasons. But in climate change, there is also what you call adaptation. So if you have more intense storms or rainfalls, and there is a lot of water, and it finds you when you're not ready to take up this much water. For example, the wetlands in the urban areas like Kampala, they've already been degraded, yet these are the natural resources, or wetlands are the ones that can take up much water like this. So these areas are no longer there. Even if the channels were left free, they would at least go downstream where people have already built, and still there would be flooding somewhere in Kampala. So with adaptation, that means Uganda is not ready.
Yeah.
We have climate changing because of things that have been done by others long ago, or people actually who are not in Uganda, like the Western countries. Actually, just to put on record, we might have been the least contributors to climate change, but that's not an excuse. We're going to suffer actually more effects than they are, because for them they have more capacity to adapt to climate change than we do. So that means we can do the things that can help us adapt. That means it's short term. We can deal with plastic disposal so that we leave the channels more free, so that when the rains come, we are able to stay away from the floods. Because battling climate change takes time.
Okay, thank you. Otafiire, I like the stand you're taking in this discussion. I must begin by confessing. So we've seen Africa is facing very many problems. Ethiopia is almost falling. M23 out of the blue sprang up yesterday, and there's an influx of refugees on Uganda's western border. We've seen South Sudan having issues. Is climate change getting lost in Africa's so many other more pressing issues? Matanda says that when something happens over a long period of time, we tend to be less reactionary to it, and we only wake up to the realities when it is too late. Is this the case that Africans are spending so much time trying to deal with today's problems, such as the M23, such as the Tigray rebels in Ethiopia, and all these other things happening? Or it's just we Africans being adamant and saying that, no. If you mine your oil, like you're saying, if you mine your oil, we also need to mine our oil and then become rich.
Yes, Toko, I think that the frames of conversation on climate change historically have been based on about 3 principles. One is historical responsibility, one is no harm principle, then another one is preservation. And what has happened at global levels is that you have had countries, the industrialized countries, admitting they bear the responsibility of the current greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. And I was reading somewhere they were saying, surprisingly, for example, sub-Saharan contribution to the greenhouse gases is by half, 1.6%, 0.6%. And then they were saying China, UK, Russia, and EU contribute 100 times bigger than sub-Saharan Africa. So honestly, when we are having conversation in terms of apportioning responsibility, I think the debate has been lost on that level where they have said, now you are responsible. This is what you did. This is what you're supposed to do to recover the injustice you committed. And just like Matanda had said, at Paris, they said they are dedicating $100 billion to adaptation and mitigation for developing countries like Uganda, because we don't have capacity to, our budgets, they are very, if you look at the budget of environment and the Ministry of Water, they are small budgets. We cannot invest in grand projects like solar.
Yes. But you invest a lot in your army as a country. You have money for the army, you seem not to have money for the environment. So if you're facing this existential threat, shouldn't it be upon you as a country to say that, oh, this is actually a very serious problem and we should deal with it? Okay, yes, And relate that to what I said earlier. Are you over dealing with these other problems, like the military problems, and forgetting that there's also a bigger aspect that is coming?
No, I agree that climate change isn't one of the biggest threats to our country as an economy. I think that debate has been amplified from the West by these environmental lobbies.
So I'm going to just pause
Am I
you there
allowed
and
to-
ask her to respond.
I think I greatly disagree because actually our economy, we are a developing country, so that means our economy is greatly dependent on agriculture. That is a fact. And if our economy depends on agriculture, moreover rain-fed agriculture, it means we are actually directly affected by changes in climate, especially where I come from northern Uganda. This year, my mom, for the first time, she's buying food in the house. But why? Because she planted 3 times beans, but they could not actually germinate because there were no rains. They would expect rain to come. It would be a shower like the previous night. But then after you've planted, rain doesn't come. And the poor woman has to go back to the garden and plant again. By the time rain comes, she's actually, maybe the season has gone, so she's left with nothing. But our economy greatly depends on exports, but these are agricultural products. So if you cannot produce well, or we cannot have high productivity in agriculture, then what are we going to export out? Our production level with other products that do not require agricultural raw materials is actually we have low capacity to do that. So I really
You want to
disagree.
respond to you?
Toko,
Then we shall move to
I'm not necessarily downplaying the issue of climate change. I'm only saying, I mean, there is a body of evidence by Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, UNFCCC, that shows climate change is caused by 95% caused by human impact.
Right.
And I agree we're facing those effects. But you and me agree that if you asked an ordinary Ugandan today, what are the most 3 pressing issues? They would tell you school closure, they would tell you recovering from a pandemic, economic recovery. I don't think those are the topical issues that are, even in our public opinion, climate change hasn't featured so vigorously, like wants to put it out here. I agree it is a serious issue, but it's not the biggest threat we have as an economy.
Mimi, why isn't climate change an issue? Why isn't it featuring in our debates? When you watch all these shows, in fact, they're called political talk shows, because 90% of the time you're going to hear that it's politics. They're going to talk about whatever the president has said, whatever is happening to Segrinya, whatever is being discussed in parliament, and seldom do we ever say, oh, there is this threat that can even take us away and stop these political discussions, and that is climate change. How come it never features?
I think it's because, like Matanda said, we're not seeing the current impact of it. And the scary thing is that why should we wait for it to become so catastrophic that we react to it? Why do we have to wait for it to get to levels that, like in places like China where they have mass industrialization? Uganda is currently developing, right? We don't negate that. Yes, I think that we should develop, but we should take responsibility while it's still not such a catastrophic and a present devastating, has a devastating effect on us currently. So I think it's upon us, like Ayoo said, and you said, throwing bottles in water bodies, and we have to take individual responsibility, because eventually, if we take it personal and we combat it on an individual basis, we're still contributing to fighting it. You see? So, and the reason why it's not being talked about is because maybe, one, people don't know about it. There's no education about it. People don't want to hear about it. People are so concerned with our political issues, what's happening with the government, what the president is saying. And if there's no conversation about it and it's not being pushed out, no one's going to discuss it. And I think that's why we have such panels, to actually put it out there and use our platforms to advocate that, hey, this is a problem. It needs to be made an actual issue, and it must be discussed.
Okay. Mr. Matanda, the youth seem to be taking a lead as far as climate change is concerned. That's something we're still going to discuss later. But for now, I just want to pick one of those young people. She's called Nakate Vanessa. She's from Uganda here. She's among the first Ugandans to feature on the cover of Time magazine. She's going places. Over the weekend, she said at a rally that Ugandans are being erased. Yeah, people in our home country, Uganda, are being erased because of climate change. She talked of people dropping out of schools. She talked of farms dying out. So, and I was reading the comments on social media. Some people were saying that her language was rather too strong and misrepresentative of the reality in Uganda. Do you feel like there's a movement that is causing so much unnecessary fear as far as climate change is concerned, or that kind of language is being used on purpose to ensure that people act, or you indeed think that that kind of language is justified and represents the truth?
Yeah, I actually think the latter, which is that there's need. In my literature in English classes, we had something called hyperbole, where you exaggerate things. And I could see it in outside, like if your mother sends you across the road, then you come back and they're like, you've taken the whole year. Well, it's not the whole year, but you get the point. They're just trying to say you've taken forever, you know, to even stretch it a bit further. So I think that the activists, so people who have taken time to study these trends, realize that the only way we can get the world's attention and people's attention is trying to be a bit alarmist about what's happening. But stretched, what she presented stretched, I could actually say is true. It is true that in Uganda, the incidences of floods, especially on the two sides of Rwenzori and Elgon, have increased. It's true that we have had cases of drought in eastern Uganda, in northern Uganda, and recently in western Uganda. Actually, yesterday, I think I saw one of our colleagues. They are chest thumping around the cattle corridor in Ankole because cattle had started dying. The drought is just unimaginable. So, and for our case, like she explained, because we are still a very poor society that is rain-fed and dependent on the seasons, you don't have systems of irrigation, etc. Even the slightest, even just a drought for 3 months will cause changes in food prices and all that, and you hear that people in Chiruhura are dying, people in Chibuka are dying. So it looks like our resilience is still very low. So I think that Nakate and activists like her may be justified in saying that, guys, we are dying. You may not be seeing it. I could, if I can draw it to a personal example, I think it is the same as the conversation around eating junk food. You know that many of us enjoy these, you know, the chickens and these other funny things that the Dr. Kasenenes of this world keep telling us, guy, you're killing yourself. You're putting yourself at a risk of cancer. But because after I take that chicken, first of all, it's very tasty, and I don't get the cancer immediately. I keep feeling, yeah, okay, yeah, I get you, you're an expert, but yeah, I'll eat it for today. We see how it goes. Maybe tomorrow I will not. They tell you maybe go to the gym or run around. Because when you go, you don't see the effects immediately. You're likely to just drop out. So I want to compare that to the climate change conversation and say, Dr. Kasenene may be just fine in telling you guys, because you're eating this junk chicken, we are dying of cancer.
So Otafiire is going to ask you, but before he comes in, you say she's exaggerating possibly, and she's doing it for the right cause. I think Plato would call that the white lie, a noble lie. You say it's a lie, but you're doing it for the right. So at the end of the day now, when you break it down and look at the immediate reaction that she received she was talking about Uganda, and the social media were looking at the comments in Uganda. They seem to make fun. They seem to say, "Hoy, does she live in Uganda? Does she know the reality in Uganda and all that?" So doesn't that then become counterproductive? If you're going to get Ugandans to react and say, "Oh, let's act," and then you so alarmist that you become quote unquote funny in your statements and you arouse laughter of those commenting, isn't that counterproductive?
It could be counterproductive, but if there was no conversation at all happening, and then at least now a conversation like that is happening, it will give an opportunity. You see, now we are discussing it, and maybe through this conversation we can clarify such that people know what is happening. So sometimes an activist will engage an extreme action to at least draw attention. That's the first thing we may have to do. Now we can clarify the facts in the process, but we need attention to be drawn to this issue.
You have something to say, Otafiire?
Yes, just responding to Matanda, I think Greta and Vanessa, notwithstanding the good message they are passing, we lack that, on Uganda's side from her, we lack that local activist in her who she appears to be engineered from outside, and when you hear her speak, she's as if she's being coached and told what to say. Sometimes speaking things that are not on ground. So that vulgarizes the original message, good message she had. So just like Greta, Greta has, I think the environmental lobby is weaponizing these young people by using them to push an agenda, by giving them a script they should play, and sometimes it's like a PR. And it's also as a way of avoiding criticism, because when you attack a child, the cancel culture, what? They will come for you. Shame on you. Why are you attacking a kid? And they're not addressing the real issues that the kid is raising. And that's my problem.
Okay. Otafiire has brought in a very interesting aspect. He has talked of the lobbies. The right and the left. The right side seem to be more of relaxed, saying, no, it's not as bad. While the left seem to be really pushing for it. And if you watch a couple of videos anywhere on YouTube, or even do some reading, you hear people that say that Greta is being coached, Greta is a young kid, following, being misled by adults, and things like that. How worried do you get as a scientist, as someone that studies climate change, and sees it from your perspective happening, that is taking that political trend, and we're going to discuss it more in the political arena than in the scientific arena?
I think it's because the politicians that we have, most of them do not have the knowledge. Just to prove what I'm saying, just with this current COP26, I was listening to the president of Nigeria, who was actually giving a presidential speech. He was demanding for the promised money, the climate finances.
That's Buhari?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. He was demanding for the money that was promised by the Western countries, but they never received. But he never presented any strategic plan that he has to fight climate change in his country. What does that mean? It means that the politicians who actually have the influence, they have the money, they have the control over everything in our country, are only interested in economic development, but they care so less about what the future will have.
Can I just chip in there?
Yes.
The politicians caring about economic development, are they being realistic?
Yes.
Because we agree that in the West, they are more resilient to climate change and its adverse effects because they are developed. Yeah? So shouldn't the African politicians be concerned that let's get our people developed, let's get our infrastructure developed, let's get our health system developed, and then we can also be as good as the West and perhaps stand a chance against climate change?
It is so realistic that you care about economic development, but we need to strike a balance, because without natural resources, actually, economic development can be at harm.
Okay.
You can do so less without the environment. If you can do, then it is too expensive. Another thing, I was not just talking about politicians caring less because of economic development, but also because they are not directly affected. Because our politicians live in town, they do not know where food comes from. They only go to the market and buy food. They don't know what affects production down there in the village by the dry season. So they don't understand the food chain, the food supply. So it is so hard to explain to them.
Okay.
And then maybe you didn't ask this, but I should answer him. Why the young people are the ones at the frontier, at the front line? Because we have longer time to live and see the impacts more than the old people.
Is that a given?
Yes.
Holding everything constant.
Yes.
More likely.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are other uncertainties with successes that our struggles right now may not succeed, but climate change is one of them. If I can't do much right now, 30 years from now, because I'm sure I'll still be living, but if I had my dad, who is already 60, he would have died by then. So I am doomed to be more concerned than he is. So I think it's as simple as that. Why the young people
Or you should wait for your time and then act.
No, because
when you're in charge.
There is no waiting, because there is no price that you can pay in a minute for climate change.
Okay.
It is a continuous behavioral.
So before we move, let me ask her this, since she's the scientist here. We've seen, and you see, human beings are very adaptive. Remember the words of Charles Darwin? Not the strongest, not the fastest,
Yes.
not the biggest, but the most adaptive to change survive of the species. So we see human beings trying to adapt. We see them getting, I read of a burger that was made from a plant. Yeah, burger is normally made from meat, but there's meat that is being produced from a plant. We've seen the GMOs come up.
Yes.
We are seeing a lot of people are developing crops that are drought resilient. There are cows that are now tick resistant, that can go longer without water. Is there? Don't this downplay then the threat of climate change? I mean, the earth could get as hot as it wants, but people are going to produce better cows that can live. There could be as many drought seasons as possible, but human beings are going to produce plants that can grow regardless of the drought. So how does that play in the scientific arena of these things?
I agree that human beings are so adaptive. That's why climate change actually, right now, the focus is more on adaptation than mitigation, because adaptation most times is short term. So however much we are adaptive, our adaptive capacity may be limited. We may not be able to sustain, especially when the climate changes to a very great extent. Right now, the increase is just about 0.8 degrees from the 1990s, but we're already feeling it. So, and we actually have those natural resources that are able to absorb. By the way, by the time over the many years, we only have 0.8 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, but we have all these oceans over the world to the lakes. How much heat do you think they've taken in so that the increase is reduced? But we see that these lakes are shrinking. So what if then we don't have them to absorb the shocks that are brought by climate change? It means even us, we cannot do much with adapting. So to just wrap it, adaptation is not long term, it is short term. So we need to focus on resilience than
Adaptation.
Yes.
You wanted to say something?
Yeah. I just wanted to make a comment on accountability for politicians. I actually attended a conference in September in Italy about political communication for climate change. And while there, we studied a number of studies and researches that have been carried out in sub-Saharan Africa. And the majority of them were actually showing that for politicians in this part of the world, if they talk about climate change, they are likely to lose the election. There were studies that showed politicians who talked about climate change and their ratings went down because the people could not comprehend what these people are talking about. As you can hear, talk about lakes shrinking and, talk about greenhouse gas emissions. These are things majority of the people would rather not engage in.
Doesn't that support what Otafiire is saying?
It does, in the sense that the threat is imminent, but it's hard for many people to understand. Now, where I depart from Otafiire is to say that those of us who know better, like governments, like scientists and leaders, because the masses are not comprehending what's going on, that also sit back and say, this does not make sense to the ordinary people. I think that governments, because of their capacity to know better and see further into the future, need to find ways of investing in checking climate change, rather than say, since the people don't care about it because they can't comprehend it, we also don't care.
You had your hand up.
Yes, I want to say something. Could it be that maybe climate change and global warming has the wrong people advocating for it? Because like Henry said, if it's the politicians, they're pushing their agenda. And like you said, Greta, are you being used as puppets and young people? So why don't we have scientists who actually know what climate change is and global warming is, advocate it, because they have the knowledge and they have the wisdom. And then also, second thing, when you talked about adaptation, we adapt. When you look at it from the perspective of developing countries and developed countries, adaptation seems expensive. So, and again, it's to our detriment as developing countries that we suffer more the effects of global warming and we can't combat them.
Okay, I'm just going to ask her to respond.
Yeah.
That's a very powerful one, especially the first one. That
I want to defend.
how come the scientists are not involved so much in the lobbying for people to be proactive against climate change? We know Vanessa Nakate studied at MOOBS. I don't think there's a science course at MOOBS. We know Greta is 16. People have been saying, go back to school and first study. There's some very harsh critics of her. How come we don't see a professor from Harvard who has done these things and then stepping out there and saying, this is a very big threat, let's act. Or even in Uganda, you never see Ugandan.
I am one of them, just that I'm coming up. Actually, I'm working on an organization. It's soon going to be out. We're just finalizing with legalizing it.
Okay.
It's going to be called UNESCO Resilience. So I'm going to be one of the scientists who are going to be activists. But I think the reason is because scientists are always busy doing research. Research takes time.
Okay.
And maybe they don't see a lot of money in this because human beings always thinking. They're always thinking about what is there for me. What am I going to gain? Activism, climate activism, actually, you give there your life because you're going to attract attention. The politicians will come after you thinking you're going to be against their agenda, yet actually you're not going to get money. So when you think the young people are being funded by people in the Western countries, you might be right, because the Western people are trying to use the people who have the time, and those are the young people who are willing to talk. So when they come in to support them, it is not always financial support. Maybe they're just coming to encourage them to do that. So scientists, I cannot say why, because I'm not going to be one of them, but I think it's to do with financial support. They always do these researches. And by the way, you cannot do everything by yourself. Yeah, that's true, because time is limited.
But can I just say, I think it also does climate change and the advocating for a disservice. If the people who have the knowledge are not coming out to speak,
And they're sitting down.
and then they're sitting down, people don't take it seriously.
Okay.
So if they leave it to politicians and young people to front, it's a good thing, because in their right, they're actually giving their opinion about it, and they're actually advocating for it. But it does the rest of those who don't trust politicians and don't trust young people. So you're left in a bracket where people are like, who do we trust? Is it real? Is it not real? And then that again is catastrophic to us, because the world is actually going to change around us, and we're left battling about if it's real, is it a myth, and the people who are actually advocating it, are they telling us lies? So where do we get to a point where we have the right people advocating for climate change, because it is happening, and politicians not using it as a platform to push, let's say, a certain agenda?
Okay.
But also
I think we shall shift the gear from there.
Yes, but I wanted to make a comment on the scientist issue, and then maybe we can have Henry.
Okay, let's have him, and then you respond.
Yes, I think that scientists are actually speaking.
Yeah.
The issue is just that the way they speak
It's
does not make sense for the people, and you know the media likes sensationalism. So when the scientist comes and says the world has grown warmer by 0.8 degrees, what is that? You know? So they speak in very abstract terms, you know, that from 1930 up to date, we have increased by these degrees Fahrenheit. Let's try now to limit it to 1.5. These are things that may not make it to the headlines because they don't make sense to the ordinary people and to the media to propagate. So the people who get airspace are the activists, because they are saying and doing extreme things, and the politicians who already have the platforms.
I thought this is the young people.
Well, the young people are the activists.
Okay.
In this case.
Otafiire, you're going to bring in your review.
Responding on the issue of politicians and their seeming inability to promote the agenda of climate change. I'm in the habit of normally condemning politicians, but for me, I think the politicians in Africa have been very proactive than politicians in the West. Maybe accidentally, but I think there's been a deliberate attempt, because remember, when these countries are going for Glasgow at that high-level event, each country is required to submit. They're called national determined contributions, like targets or commitments each country will make in achieving a global collective goal. So I think I have been reading some information, and I was surprised that our transition from nowhere, they normally say we transition from, but we have never been, we are trying to industrialize, but they're saying we should transition from nowhere to somewhere. That is the new energy. And I've been finding that 50% of transition has happened in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, than in the West. While they are telling us stop investing in fossil fuels, there they are subsidizing, they are financing the corporations that deal in fossil fuels. So I think perhaps just like Toko said, politicians here are awake to the fact that issues of climate change may not appear popular. Perhaps they are not in their manifestos, but surprisingly, they have done some incredible milestones.
I think it's not surprising. It's just that the conceptual waste, which you mentioned, has, if you go and investigate those actions, those solar-powered projects, and you'll find the Western capital. So it's possibly the funding.
Perhaps.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's now come back home, and I want to begin with Matanda this time. You're the expert in science. Matanda is an expert in law. Matanda, where does Uganda stand as far as law, policies, the plans, projections on climate change are concerned? Are we adequately prepared, at least legally?
Yeah, I usually disagree with the people who say, you know, Uganda has very good policies, but the problem is implementation. I think that in many areas we actually don't have good policies. They are not good in the sense that they are not organic. They don't speak to our reality. They are just copied in from some other societies. But for the case of climate change, and maybe now to agree with Henry, I should say our policies and the laws are actually up to date. Just this year, Parliament passed the Climate Change Act. I don't know, I've not followed whether it has been assented to by the president. But when you read through the act, you see that if it's complied with, we would be ahead, I think, of everyone. For example, there is a requirement to inculcate climate change education in our curriculum. Someone kept talking about how people are not educated about climate change from as early as high school. So education at different levels. There are policies that require in the law every budget and every ministry, department, and agency of government in every project and program they carry out to sort of come up with, just like we have had the certificates of gender parity, now a requirement for a certificate to show that the project is compliant with checking climate change. And then there are also obligations from government in every budget to invest in climate restoration compliant things. So in terms of the law and policies, I think we are in a good place. Now, maybe I now will also parrot the usual claim that whereas we have the good policies and the law, the question may be in implementation, because I think at times we are captured by the lobbies, and then we go into these things without fully thinking about where we are, what we want to do. So you find that the commitment you're making in the Climate Change Act actually contradict some of the commitments you have made with your development agenda and Vision 2040. So the devil is in the details.
Otafiire, you want to come in?
Yeah, I agree with Matanda. We have made the tremendous steps in putting good policies and laws in Uganda. My worry, though, is that in the global policy regime, we have been robbed, our agenda has been lost. There is a serious campaign in divestiture. How do we transition? How do World Bank, IMF, these multinationals that sponsor our activities, they are saying we should stop funding natural gas, oil, yet these are the base for us to industrialize. And you know, we had a third industrial development decade from 2016 to 2025, and there's an attempt for the continent to industrialize. But how we re-industrialize when our natural endowed, cheap, economically sustainable resources are being, are being capped, and they're telling us that we shouldn't exploit them. And yet we have existential needs for us to tap them and also leapfrog ourselves from backward nations to industrialized nations. That's my worry.
Okay, so Mimi,
Yes.
you've listened to what Matanda said about the law, and you're a law student.
Yes.
We've seen the government taking a couple of actions that would otherwise be in direct contradiction to the kind of protection we need to arm ourselves with against climate change.
Yeah.
As we talk now, Bugoma Forest. There's a whole group of activists that are saying that this forest is being given out to a sugarcane grower. In 2007, I must have been like in P7, there was that other Mavidia forest was being given away.
Yeah.
We've seen the government, NEMA almost sleeping on its job when, like what she said earlier, people reclaim these swamps, establish their apartments and whatever they establish. Someone along that Chira, Najera Chira Road, established their nightclub in a swamp and even mocked them by naming it Swampies. Yeah? It's in a swamp and then it's like they mocked me by calling it Swampies.
Yeah.
So when you see these things, people getting away with all these things and the government sometimes being directly involved in this,
Yeah.
do you still remain optimistic that the laws and the good policies that I talked about will ever be implemented, or you think it's just lip service?
You know, it's a funny thing when it comes to policies, especially in our country. We've seen policies being implemented, like you said, but there's no follow through on them. And first of all, I wanted to go back to what Henry was saying. I think if we, as a people and as a country, set policies in place, we need to set them from a perspective of them being effective here, and not looking to the Western world and their agenda on what they're saying, what global warming is, and then we create our policies around that. We have to create them based on where we are and how we're affected, right? And then collectively, they can be implemented. And I think government needs to take the responsibility as the leaders, as the head, to make sure that when they set these policies in place, they actually follow through. Because again, what's their mandate? It's the people.
Okay.
And I think we, like right now in this panel where we're sitting, where we come from our different capacities where we're from, we actually have to make sure we're openly putting out the agenda and holding government accountable.
Okay.
You see?
Let's go back to Molly now. Molly, there have also been some progress as far as climate change is concerned. We know, for instance, that the government banned the importation of cars that are extremely old. And we know that those cars impact the environment more negatively, even if they are both fossil fuel burning than the newer ones. We've not seen any climate change activists arrested. This country is known for arresting activists. Yeah, we haven't seen any of them arrested so far. So do you get it that the government, maybe, despite what Molly said and the question I asked her, maybe the government is somehow more reactive and agreeing that, okay, there is a problem, let's try to address it?
Yeah, it is true. The political will may be there, but maybe it's again too low. We need more pressure because we run short of time with climate change. Climate change, nature doesn't wait for you. You cannot plead with it that, please, I'm not ready today, wait for me tomorrow. So the political will, I agree, it's there, but we need more political will in dealing with environmental things.
Okay. And then for Uganda's case, still with you, how do you think, has COVID accelerated or decelerated our threat as far as climate change is concerned? Where has COVID left us? Is it going to be worse? Is it going to be leaving us better?
I think COVID has left us worse. First of all, it has taken the attention away from climate change, because before COVID came, climate change was actually coming up. But when COVID came, because if someone sees a relative dying, they give that pandemic more attention. But now that we're adapting to COVID, and we need to come back to climate change and do both. Actually, if climate change would be given the same views, the same attention as COVID was given, then it would be better off.
Okay.
Can I just say
yes,
something?
you can say something.
I think the problem also lies where we wait for a situation to happen and then we react to it. We don't take the steps beforehand to make sure that we're curbing certain situations before they happen. And that's where the problem is. Look at COVID. It hit, then we reacted. You see, so why should we wait for climate change to become so catastrophic that we react?
Okay.
You see?
Otafiire, your submissions have been underlined by this aspect of the global north, the global south, the west, the lobbyists. You call that group the divestiture, and all these things of the west. So Africa seems, in so many things, never to have an agenda. It's hoarded, it's pulled this way, pushed that way by the more, what Museveni would call the more organized group of people. So is climate change, despite your beliefs, something that Africa is going to unite Africans, at least for once, either to oppose the move by the West or to say, for us now, we are taking a stand as Africa? Do you see Africa uniting at any one point all getting united by climate change?
Unfortunately, we had that opportunity to stand together. I think that was, it is a group of G77, where there was China and other developing countries. We had an opportunity, I think we lost it, because perhaps the divide between global north and south is more defined by the financial clout. Being a lot of less developed countries, we don't always enjoy the bargaining power on such global platforms, and we are demobilized, and we seem not have a common African agenda, and that's frustrating.
Okay, so Matanda, the African politicians who seem to lose elections when they mention climate change, how do we reach out to them? Yeah, if we on this table want to involve the politicians, but know that whatever we're going to involve them in is not as controversial as homosexuality in Uganda, but equally controversial and could cost them an election. So how do you get them on board and say, let's get this action and act?
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with an issue that happens long term and that is complex, the duty you have then is to try and break it down. So I think, and this is where the scientists come in. Like that meeting I attended, because I attended that meeting as a politician, it was actually seeking to do that, to try and break it down for us as politicians, as I was then, to understand first that the threat is real, such that we are converted, so to speak, ourselves to understand what's going on, the science, however basic it may be. Two, to understand how to break it down for the ordinary voter, because politicians think in terms of votes. How do you present the message in a way that is palatable? For example, rather than just talk about climate change as a concept, you could speak about the things that people are seeing. Because some of the things we have described here, like this cattle corridor, the drying of grass and all that, these are things that people are going through. And so as a politician, if you're running in that area, how you structure your message for people to understand that actually, oh wait, this is happening not as a punishment from God, but because of A, B, C, D. And if we do this, this could change. So my first bet is on empowering the politicians with knowledge, and then the politicians in turn breaking down this climate change thing into things that people can easily comprehend and understand.
Thank you very much, our viewers and the panel. That was a very interesting round of the discussion. We are going to have the second round. I hope it will be as equally fire blazing and magical as this has been. So let's have a short break and then we return back. Welcome back, our dear esteemed viewers, to the second part episode of the discussion. We are continuing with our discussion on climate change and the youth, and we are now going to make this round more about the youth and look at our country, Uganda, like we did in the first. So let's move back to Molly. Molly, who is our expert. She knows a thing or two. She studies this every day in class, and she hopes to impact the world as a scientist, activist, not just an activist with all the science. So Molly, I want to understand from you. Uganda is the youngest country in the world, or at least the second youngest country in the world, depending on what you read. We have such a youthful population. We are producing every year. We've moved to 42 million people right now in a very, very short period of time. And that means that there's a lot of nocturnal activities happening in Uganda at night, as far as production is concerned of human beings. So how is this compatible with your quest to ensure that the climate is preserved? If we become more and more over time, like we're doing right now, how huge is the threat? How huge is that a threat to climate change, and how do we reverse this?
Population growth, of course, is a threat to climate change because when we produce more and we do not space our children, we shall need more space. And that's why people they are expanding into the wetlands. Okay. Now it's no longer only in the urban areas where wetlands are reclaimed for settlement, but even in villages, which was not happening in the past. But because the villagers are the ones who produce so much, and the parents don't have money to buy land to settle their children, so they go for the wetlands, which are termed as free land. Actually, they used to call it wastelands. So population growth is a direct threat to climate change.
So how do we counter that? Is it a question of telling Ugandans that, would you support a government legislation, for instance, as a direct question? Would you support if government say that if you're in Uganda, you cannot produce more than 2 kids?
2 would be small for Uganda, that averagely has been producing 6 per family. We could talk about 4 or 3, but it's one way of tackling climate change.
Okay.
It's just a way of reducing pressure on the natural resources that we have.
Okay. Otafiire, there's a lot of activity going on in Uganda, in the civil society world, as far as sexual reproductive health is concerned. We've seen the distribution of all these means of contraceptives that should delay and ensure there's child spacing, delay early pregnancy and all these things. Yet the population seems to defy all that. It is still growing exponentially. From your own non-science perspective, but the one that is informed by the research you do at the Great Lakes Institute of Social Studies, how should we go about this as a country best?
I think there are many people who have said that youth marriage can be an opportunity if we do certain things right. So for me, I think saying let's control population is going to be the magic wand to get out of this mess. No, we have to have deliberate plans, interventions, to make sure that, because we have the resources to maintain this population, if we have been able to sustain the industrial waste for whatever many years, why don't we do something and embrace the youth barge and turn it to our advantage?
Okay.
Yes.
So, maybe you want to say something like that?
Yes, I actually want to agree with Henry on that point. Why do we have to stop people from having children to curb climate change? I mean, look at places like China. They have the one-child policy, and they still have mass production, and they still have issues around climate change. So I think population growth differs away from the actual solution to climate change. It could be one of them, yes, like you said. Again, I think adaptation is expensive for our current country and our current economic situation. So what do you mean by adaptation?
What I mean is that when climate change reduces your ability to produce much, then you should be able to only have children that you're capable of taking care of. If you can't have much yield in your farm, then you can't feed so many children as then when you are just producing on a small farmland and you're getting much yields.
So then how do we get government to limit and say you have the right to family, but still give people their right to have children and still find a way to curb climate change? Where's the silver lining from that respect?
You want to respond?
Yes. Like I said, there is a relationship between climate change and population growth, and I explained that and said, when we have much pressure, population growth, a big population presents more pressure on natural resources. But these natural resources are reducing with climate change. For example, forests. With more climate change, forest cover also reduces. And families that are dependent on forest resources will be the ones affected. Yet these are the families that produce the most.
Mr. Abubaker, now that is the real conundrum. We have a huge population that is growing. We have a huge chunk of that population does not even believe. They say that the poorer people in Uganda are more likely to have even more kids than the ones that
the rich ones.
that are well off.
That's true.
I was having a conversation with a politician who now happens to be the Speaker of Uganda, Olanya, and he was saying that whenever he goes back to the village and he goes to visit his voters, someone will bring a kid and say, "Oh, thank you for coming. I have now given you this one. You can go and take care of him. I'll go and get another one for myself." So for them, it's that easy. They can always have these kids, and they feel like they're in their own world. For them, having a kid is as natural, as certain that they must always do it. Yeah. So they have nothing to do with climate change. They don't even know that. How do you bring these realities to that person in Kapele Byong and say, "Oh, you can have kids, but you can only have them if you can look after them," like she said. And if we collectively, as the human species, are less likely to sustain and look after ourselves because of climate change, then we need to scale down on the number of kids we're having.
Okay, thank you. First of all, to support her point, I was just looking at it from a point of forest cover, like she mentioned. I was reading a study that by independence, over 50% of Uganda was covered by forests. As we speak today, we're at 80%. So I don't know where we shall be in the next 10 years. And forests and forest cover is particularly important because you realize that we are discussing burning fuels, and our people largely depend on firewood, charcoal. Of course, when you look at it globally, like we stated earlier, the contribution we really make on a global scale is negligible, less than 4%. But even in our small ways, we may have to find ways on how to replace this. Now, imagine a situation where we no longer have firewood, and then you have a family of 12, 13, 15 members. Trouble, and so it becomes necessary for us to have conversations. So part of the conversation in climate change is the whole issue of renewable energy, you know? And so that would mean we need to be interested. Maybe you can have your 14 kids. How do we now make sure that you have electricity to cook? Of course, there are also conversations around turbines and the fuel they use, but yeah, that sort of conversation. So, but you ask, how do we deal with these realities? A few years ago, I participated in the development of a presidential manifesto, and I compared it with a presidential manifesto in a Scandinavian country. The other manifesto was just one page with 5 policy areas. We were here developing a manifesto of over 300 pages. So I sat back and said, but wait a minute. This manifesto of 300 pages in 5 years, what is this? And then I realized that our societies are complex. They are complex in the sense that almost nothing has been transformed. So when you are developing a manifesto, you are expected to deal with matters of governance, education, health, security, gender, climate change, everything, which is not, how do you deal with all these things in 5 years? Because a manifesto is like a 5-year mandate. But you see, you cannot write a manifesto and leave out issues of maternal health. You cannot write a manifesto and leave out issues of education. Because there are emergence questions in every sector. So that just means that the society we are dealing with is a problematic one, that we are still at that level, down at that level of the pyramid where it's a big struggle. And so we cannot have simplistic answers. I cannot just tell you that do this and that will be sorted. So to answer your question, I think that the answer to deal with those very complex issues has to do almost with everything. It has to do with ensuring that education reaches where it's supposed to be. Because of the opportunity I've had to be educated, even without me doing anything, the colleagues I started with in P1 that dropped out and didn't get an opportunity to go as far as I've gone, already have 8, 10 kids. I only have 1. So that shows you that
You even have 1.
you see, I even have 1. Some people don't even have any. So that just shows that education itself sorts some of those things. But now, even beyond just the automatic changes in worldviews and how you view things and how you plan for your children, so even in the mindset, like you are describing that scenario in Right Honorable Jacob Olanya's constituents, maybe as you study, you get to understand that, wait a minute, children are not just a blessing from God that you must have as a matter of course. God has actually given you capacity and choice to choose how many you want to have and to plan for them, you know? Yeah, so that's on the front of education. On the other front, which I've already hinted on, is the whole conversation around renewable energy. Asking ourselves, how can we keep eating and have light and have, energy, but at the same time, without having to destroy our environment or to use fuel alternatives that emit a lot of gases. These are conversations that we are not having. And to tie it in with what we were talking about earlier with Henry, you know, Henry's point was that the biggest contributors to this thing are right there. And we are right here. We're now trying to cap our development, saying we need to deal with climate change. I hope that among the negotiations that are happening in Glasgow during that COP26 are conversations around how those who have created the problem can actually now avail money
And repair.
yes, to enable, if for example, we must not exploit the oil in Uganda, and our estimation is that we are going to get $2 billion every year from exploiting that oil. Can we now have a conversation about someone having to pay for that? It may not be 2 billion, but can we say, okay, maybe if we are to compromise and say we are going to get less, but for the larger global order, the world has availed this much for us to be able to do the rest of the things we are supposed to do. So I think that at a local level, I see a partnership in education. At the governance, global issue, I see the partnership in discussing alternative sources of fuel.
Okay, now we are back with Molly. So, Molly, there is this aspect of religion, faith.
Can I respond to Matanda shortly?
Okay.
The problem I found with this narrative of saying, and this has been coming from the West, when they are saying one of the alternative ways of getting out of this mess is population control. You know, even before we think of population control, we already have serious issues that are affecting the Africans. I've been looking at the national grid connectivity, and what I found surprising was that video gamers in California consume more electricity than some of the countries in Africa. Video gamers. Then I read somewhere also they are saying a Tanzanian consumes a fifth of a typical American refrigerator. Just imagine. So that's conversation from renewable energy.
Let me just bring it.
Where are we transitioning from? Because half of the African population has no electricity.
So just to play the devil's advocate, is it that Africa is having these problems because of the population increase? Possibly, if Uganda had 15 million people, maybe it would be easier to connect them to the national grid, maybe it would be easier to educate them, provide health for them, and also in that, it would be easier, Uganda would still maintain its forest cover. Yeah? Do you think that these things link? Like I'm trying to think that they link.
Toko.
So,
I don't think that logic flies, because if you're to look at, for example, Uganda's land mass, and you look at the population density, and you look at, say, the UK, you'll be shocked.
So, yes, UK is about 70 million, Uganda is about 41 million, and the land mass is almost the same.
Yes.
That's granted. Now, the other aspect of it would be that in the UK, someone is going to build a skyscraper. In terms of an apartment, it's going to house half of Nigeria's population.
That's true.
Yeah? But in Nigeria, which is in Uganda, everyone needs their small chunk of land to build their small house. And then for all of them, they will have a car. All of them will go to the... So, that, I mean, the UK has solved one problem of land with one skyscraper that costs maybe $20 million. But to get a skyscraper worth $20 million in Uganda, it's possible it doesn't exist. So, yeah, I see what you're trying to say, but then I'm also trying to acknowledge that it can't just be about the population. It can also be about which population do you have. Yeah? I mean, if you have 100 cats to protect you, maybe the one with one lion is better than the one that has the 100 cats. Because if the mere fact that people hear that there's a lion there, they won't even step closer.
So I think what you have introduced, and thank you for this, is the whole issue. It's not about the quantity of your population, but the quality.
Exactly.
Yes, and that's a whole conversation now together. What you're all drawing to our attention, and I agree, is that possibly maybe we should not just discuss how many the population growth, but how do we improve the human capital?
Yeah. So for instance, again, if you talk about the UK, you would be shocked how many foreigners are counted there because they went there for education, because they have good education. You'll be shocked how many billionaires they have compared to Ugandan billionaires, for instance. So one billionaire can literally change the status quo in all that place. So for me, I feel like, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate in this, unfortunately, I feel like maybe the population aspect is something we're trying to run away from. We can have our population, But like I said to Otafiire, maybe if we were 10 million Ugandans, I hope I would have been part of the 10 million if they took away 30 million. So if we're only 10 million, maybe then we would be better off providing education, providing health, providing infrastructure, and still maintaining our environment as it is. So maybe the complexity now is that we are not that. I don't think there was any time when China's population was as Uganda's population. They possibly grew, I mean, they already many even in 1900, but again, maybe they were better educated. Maybe they could make crafts better. And for us now, we seem stuck. A lot of people not going out of school. COVID has made it even more complicated and all that. Yes, Otafiire, say something and then we move on.
I think that's what the issue of population boom isn't necessarily a challenge. Because if you look at the climate change policy and debate, it is rooted in some climate, colonial legacy. Because if we had, if our industrial agenda is well designed and implemented, we could absorb this boom and give them jobs, and also sustainably grow our economy, considering that climate change is also a reality. The problem is that all the policies are aimed at undermining our advantage. When they're saying renewable energy, they are saying that they are bringing solar renewable energy into our market because we're not producers. So if we appreciate that we can have industrialization, we can utilize these natural resources and build an industrial base, it can change our fortunes as a country and perhaps give us a competitive advantage on a global stage.
Thank you. So I was with Molly. We shall leave that discussion at that unless it comes up later. So I was with Molly and I was saying that there is the whole aspect of faith. We've just talked of population. When I was a Christian, we would say yours is to fill the world. God made Adam and Eve and said, go and fill the world. So how much does such faith, such belief, and Matanda mentioned this earlier, that people believe that the earthquakes in Bududa, I mean the landslides, have absolutely nothing to do with climate change or whatever is being done in California. It has everything to do with the fact that we threw away a stone that the God said should always be here. Or we crossed the river and our grandfather, great-great-grandfather had warned us not to cross that river. So how do you change the perspective and get those people to believe that while God exists, while he said fill the world, he possibly meant that where we have already filled the world and we should take care of what is on our plate. And the fact that your grandmother is not the reason, whatever she said is not the reason the landslides in Bududa. The landslides are here because you've cut down the trees that would scale down the rain. You've settled in the swamps that act as water catchment areas. And now the land gets wet, it gets soaked, and it has no other option but to roll down. How do you bring that such a vulnerable population?
I think it goes back to breaking the knowledge down, just like he has always mentioned, my colleague Matanda, because the believers are always not interested in understanding. They just believe and pray that their faith is right. So if you explain to them how this is connected to the movement of the soils coming down, the heavy rains, I think it can make them understand and believe that it is connected to climate change.
Okay. Otafiire, are your views informed anyway by religion? It's informed by that strong Pan-Africanist view that the West is always against us? Or you genuinely believe that?
I believe in science, and because science states facts, religion is premised in myth, in
These are the people bringing us problems. To be an earthquake now.
Just mobilizes our fear. I don't believe in it actually. I think science can be our starting point if we are to push any debate on climate change. And I understand these pastors, there is a whole industry booming in the Pentecostal movement. Perhaps that message that says, look here, you have sinned, COVID has come, repent, but bring your tithes. So it is quite tricky. And I think government needs to regulate which kind of information are we giving out.
Okay. Mimi, what do you say on the issue of religion, faith, belief, and the myths on climate change?
Okay, first of all, let me just say that I'm a believer and I'm a born-again Christian. And I
Hope
think...
you don't slap
No, I mean Henry's entitled to his own opinions and his own views.
Being born again constrains her.
No, well, not really. But I believe that sometimes people, just because you're a believer, it doesn't mean that you have to leave behind your understanding and your wisdom. The Bible says, replenish the earth. He didn't. God did not. I'm pretty sure God did not mean when He said replenish the earth. He means replenish it and destroy it. Be stewards of the earth. In other words, take care of the earth. So I think people who have the understanding and the idea that global warming is happening and it's a sign, therefore we should just leave the world as it is and let it destroy itself, is a wrong mentality.
Okay.
We actually have to think of, because it's like me, let me give you the analogy of you having a house, right? You own a house. Now just because you bought the house, you're like, you know what? I'll buy the house and let me leave it dirty and messy. Because I'll eventually leave the house and get out of it. What kind of thinking is that? You have to actually take care of the house because you own the house and you bought it. And you have to leave it as you found it. If it was in a good condition, leave it better than you found it. If you found it in a bad condition, try and fix it.
Okay.
You know, we have to have that mentality that yes, we have faith, yes, we have believers, but we actually have to have understanding. And I feel that some people, like Ayoo said, that we don't have understanding of certain things. And then about science. Science is man-made, and I do have my views on that. And I think it's fine for you to have your own views, but no, God is very much present and real.
Okay,
Henry.
let's listen to Matanda's view on that, and I'll come back to the side. And
Yeah, thank you very much. I think what I believe and think about this much of draws from what you have said. The whole concept of being a steward or stewardess, if you like. I come from a school of thought of saying, you know, you could meet the believers where they are, you know, and say, you are a steward or stewardess. And that means that you have a duty. So God has given you this earth, you know, for you to benefit from it. But a steward or stewardess has a duty to ensure that whatever they are managing is not wasted. And so we could actually say, true, this is the landslide, the wildfires in Europe. It could actually be true that they are punishment from God because of us failing in our duty of being good stewards over the property that, you know, we have been given. So I think that rather than maybe try to use science to condemn the believers, I actually think that they have a duty here, and the religious leaders have a duty to actually lead the charge in saying that we have abused and corrupted what God gave us. And so there is need, for example, to plant trees. There is need to ensure that things like wetlands and others are preserved as part of the stewardess. The faith I subscribe to, which is Islam, actually puts it this way, that each and every person is a shepherd. I don't know if the word shepherd exists. We're trying to be as much gender neutral as possible. And on the day of judgment, you are going to be accountable for everything, every little resource, every little form of leadership, everything you are made to be in charge of. You're going to be accountable.
okay.
And so if it's a river that you are in charge of, if it's a garden, if it's money, if it's a leadership position, you are going to account on how you use it and how you utilize it. And so I see an opportunity there in engaging the believers and meeting them where they are to say, well, realize God gave us this space for us to utilize it and make it better and ensure that posterity also enjoys it, and the other animals. By the way, some of the biggest victims of this whole thing are the other animals. You know, the forests that are burning in Australia, you can imagine the horror that is visited on the animals in those forests. Okay. And so as a Muslim, you'll be accountable for that if you had an opportunity. It was within your circle of influence to do something about it and you didn't. Okay. Yeah.
Now, Molly, do you know someone called Dr. Kasenine?
Not really, but I've heard about him. I don't know much.
He's a nutritionist who tweets on what we should and shouldn't do, and someone recently warned him that they're about to beat him.
Because he keeps talking about
overdoes it. So I'm thinking, like, when I look at climate change, it becomes as onerous as that there is so much that we are, if we are to adhere to all the rules of climate change, would we really live on this earth? I mean, wouldn't drive all the cars you see on this compound, wouldn't have these cameras looking at us, wouldn't eat meat. You said that they produce nitrogen, which is a green gas, methane, which is a green gas. There's just too much out there that is are the restrictions.
Just a joke. In that conference that I mentioned, I attended in September, at the beginning, one of the participants, an activist, raised an issue and said, you guys were here discussing climate change, and we all flew in here.
Exactly.
You cannot imagine how much
gas
greenhouse gases. And then the organizers also didn't give us like notebooks and books, and it was a serious issue. So towards the end, when people were saying, if you know those forms they give you to evaluate, someone raised it and said, no, you see, paper, moving towards the paperless environment. Yeah.
So there's, even in Glasgow that came up, someone said all these leaders flew planes here to come and talk how people should stop emitting green gases. So just how realistic is this idea that we can live in a world without all of these things? I wouldn't take a border, I would probably walk back home. Someone said that you shouldn't use a water heater. It has something to do with climate change. The milk there came from a cow. You shouldn't take milk. So just how realistic is this? Isn't this so much to ask of human beings?
Yeah, it seems much, but it is an effort worth sacrificing. But I wouldn't agree that we have to let go of all these things. For example, it is a process. Tackling climate change is a process that you cannot achieve it in one day, like I've always said. And there are things that you can do and you don't suffer much effect, and the things you can let go. Actually, it is to do with luxury. For example,
but one man's luxury may be another person's necessity.
That's true. So it is behavioral sometimes that you have to let go of something that you can live without doing. For example, if you have a family of 3 and you are all owning cars, it becomes unrealistic. You can wake up in the morning and one person drives, you all sit in that same car, you drop this, you drop the child, you take your wife to work. So it means you're improving on your behavior. And then another thing.
African presidents wouldn't like that.
Yeah, they wouldn't like. So that's what climate change calls of us. Then another thing that I would like to say is that the Western country, like you've always been saying that their agenda is political, they want to keep us down. They are actually committing, because the discussions already that they are ready to pay. There is something they call, there is a mechanism they use. They pay for an activity that is environmentally friendly. Just that.
Carbon trade.
Yes, carbon trade. So they are willing to give in money as the developing countries like Uganda will leave the non-environmental friendly activities and go to the ones that are environmentally friendly. So it is now upon us to see how we can tap that opportunity, we can tap that finance. And actually it's complicated to get, because I tried doing that for my organization, but it needs a lot of procedures and it all goes back to the government. So we need to find out how we can tap into that opportunity that climate change has brought.
Okay. It's designed that you don't get it.
You get it, but you need a lot of delegations.
I want to ask you next. We've seen you've been castigating the West quite a lot, and I'm now giving you an opportunity to do it again. So we've seen that when the West wanted market in the industrial ages, they thought of colonialism. They came to Africa and colonized all these places and were forced to buy their products and use them. We now see that they are steadily moving through their competition over the years to making the Teslas of this world, those electronic vehicles that are just charged. We see that now they are moving to selling solars. They are moving. So could this be something that is being highly exaggerated, just so that the world is scared enough and falls into the trap of buying the new products that they are making and discarding the old? So that I can say, oh, my old car, let me leave that. I now have to get a Tesla, and then the Americans get money out of that.
You stated it properly. You know, surprising, the West has done what they call agenda setting. They have designed that way that the only solution out of this chaos is transition. And we are saying we are transitioning from what? Because half of Africa doesn't have electricity. And they are saying we go to solar and what? So what I'm saying is that actually they are posturing. What they are preaching water, and they are drinking wine. I have been reading somewhere that while they are promoting diversity in Africa, in UK, Russia, EU, USA, they are subsidizing and financing fossil fuel projects. And I have also seen somewhere that UK has 42 gas-powered plants, and then Japan has 52 powered coal. They are up and running. So on one hand, they are saying you guys you can divest, but for them they are not doing it. So because they are saying if we push this narrative, the Africa will buy it. We shall have market for the electric cars. We shall do away with these automobiles that emit greenhouse gases. We shall buy solars because we don't have industries for solars here.
Let me say something to
She
that.
wants to say something.
Okay, we may look like puppets being used by the Western countries, but to some extent, I would like to justify that in this way. Africa seems to have more potential than the Western Africans have. For example, it comes to...
The Western?
Yes.
Okay.
In what?
When it comes to planting trees, we still have vacant land. When it comes to electricity, we can actually have electricity, but clean electricity. For example, the hydropower. It is sustainable. It is given by nature. And our water bodies, they have more potential than the Western countries
Can
have.
I respond? That's what
So, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, but
let me-
maybe I could also,
I wanted to ask the questions, then
Yeah.
since he's going to respond, maybe we can, because mine also may solicit response
could say
from
something.
his. And I'm thinking, I also want him to define, when you talk about Western powers, sometimes it gets a bit gray in the sense that, for example, in this climate change issue, we know that there is not a coherent position from the West. We know that even in the West, climate change is a big debate. It's a
Right.
contested
It has
issue.
no boundaries.
So when we
Right.
say there's someone said somewhere trying to make sure we don't grow what, who is this? Because we know, for example, that President Donald Trump, while in power, he withdrew from the convention and he's saying climate change is a hoax. So where was the script at that point? So I think that it has also become a problem for us as Africans in being, we have had so many atrocities visited on us for the last over 400 years that we are too sensitive to create. Yes. So we have suffered so much that we have become so sensitive and reactionary, even sometimes where the threat does not exist. So where we are supposed to step up and negotiate, we just run and hide, and then some are bottled.
let's give him a second.
Can I just...
shortly.
Okay.
Oh, wait, let us ask him to respond.
Yeah, I just want to say something to
You're
what
very
Henry
popular
said.
with the panelists. So.
We need to, as Africans, we need to stop being followers and set our own agenda and not follow the agenda of the West, because their agenda does not cater to our needs or even our responses to climate change. So we need to actually tailor our decision making in terms of what's best for us and what are we trying to do in our current circumstance. Because the West is not going to try and solve our issues, and we can't even look to them for an answer because they don't have it. So what exactly are we doing by looking to people who have no answers? It's like the blind following the blind.
Otafiire,
To
respond very
respond
fast.
to the scientist, my problem with the West, with the big powers for that matter, is that they set these grand commitments, but they never fulfilled them. Just like you said, in the Paris Agreement, they had said they would dedicate $100 billion to help Africa adapt and mitigate climate change. But I'm told that the deadline was 2020. They have only delivered 80 billion. So they have a shortfall $20 billion. And then you have heard about carbon trading and carbon markets. They are saying they can pay us, we reforestate, and then we sink the carbon from the air. But they never deliver on those
So I think
commitments.
the problem
Okay, now
there is
let's just hold that one there, because now I have to move to the other panelists, and then we come back and conclude. So I'm going to move to Mimi. Mimi, there are also those that say that this generation of yours, the one to which Vanessa belongs, Greta Thunberg, and all those young climate change activists, is hypocritical. That you've been the biggest beneficiaries of climate change, of the pushes of climate change.
Yeah.
You're driven to school, you use water heaters, you have fridges in your homes. Like all these are the push factors of climate change. That now that you've benefited from them, you all of a sudden saying, this is the problem. So do you find some sense in that? You feel that what they're saying is true, that you people shouldn't be the ones pushing for this, having benefited all this much from what are the push factors?
I think we have to look at it from a sensible perspective. When we talk about the young generation, who are we talking about?
Let's say below 30.
Are we talking about...
Let's anyone below 30.
Okay, in Uganda. So let's ask ourselves, which person below... Does every person below 30 have a car?
No.
Does every person below 30 use a water heater?
No.
Do they cook on gas?
Okay, let's make it simple. Those that have those things, should they be appreciative that climate change, despite its bad, has given them a more comfortable and soft life?
Yeah.
Should they also be concerned?
I think it's actually an all-around that we each have to take responsibility in our own capacities, where we are and how we operate. So in my house, let's say, for example, I think the problem is that we talk about climate change, but we don't give people practical solutions that they can actually use in their day-to-day lives. So if you're using gas in your house, how much gas should you be using, and how can you actually stop contributing to greenhouse gases? If you're driving a car, do you have to be driving your car Monday to Sunday? Okay. You see, so those are the questions we should ask the scientists. We have these things like cars, and they emit fossil fuels. We don't negate that. We use gas in our house. We use charcoal. So how can we use charcoal but not use it too much that it damages the environment? And so we have to find a silver lining. And these are answers that people like Molly need to give us. How can we use charcoal but still be efficient enough to take care of our environment? How can we use our cars but still not contribute too much to greenhouse gases? So we have to find a balance and actually educate people on what the balance is, because we can't stop climate change. We can only try and decrease it. Exactly.
Okay. Matanda, just last week there was a group of young people that came here selling stoves. They called them energy-saving stoves for cooking at home. They showed how you could use it and then use its own version of charcoal that they said lasts as much as 1 year. So is climate change and the pushback from the human beings a very big opportunity for African young people to put their brains to the best and come up with solutions? Or do you think we are already disadvantaged, that from where we are, the kind of education we get and all that, we may not match up, and it becomes, again, what Otafiire said, an opportunity for the West, the youths in the West, to make money out of it to our disadvantage?
Yeah, thank you. I think, thinking in terms of like an entrepreneurial mind, I've always held the position that the status of Africa for the young people is actually an opportunity. If you're Norwegian, you're a young person in Norway, you probably have very little that you can do, because almost everything has been done. There are very few basic causes to champion. So, people end up in things like animal rights. And I'm not downplaying animal rights, but I'm saying in this part of the world, just when you're talking about an animal right, you see a child being hit, So, coming from that position is to say, as young people, we could look at this as an opportunity where almost everything has not been done, and then now there are dangers like this. And so in every sector, there's an opportunity for a revolution. Okay. I've always given the example of bricklaying. Tell people that the way we lay bricks in Uganda, this method was in serious societies, was used in the 1600s of laying 2 bricks at a go and then putting them in, something and burning them using firewood. So even there's room for revolutionizing that area. And we may not have to reinvent the wheel, because a lot of these things have been done elsewhere. So to take that to the climate change conversation, I think that there is an opportunity for young people to innovate around these creative things. The only challenge is still in the hypocrisy we are talking about, where there is a lot of talk around the world, but for example, there is no serious money invested in such initiatives.
Okay. We are now winding up, so I'm going to get your conclusions, and I'm going to start from here. So you'll wind up, just in your conclusion, just tell us climate change and young girls and young women in Africa. How do these two relate? We hear that the young girls are being affected the most and out. Yes. So what do you think from the perspective of someone that studied this?
I think it's true that women women, that means also the girls, they're marginalized. They have always been vulnerable whenever there is a pandemic. But in this aspect of climate change, it is because we're the ones that do the most in households. We're the ones that provide firewood. So whenever we don't have forestry, like we don't have forest resources nearby, we spend more hours to go and look for these resources, even fetch water, rather than spending time doing productive work like education or production. So that's how we become more victims than the males.
Okay, Otafiire, in your conclusion, I want to just tell us, how do you think Africa should pull itself out of the crisis that it finds itself in, as far as climate change is concerned, where it is being dictated to what to do and can't even have its own stand?
I think this week Africa will be celebrating what they call, it's a UN commemoration that's called Africa Industrial Week. And it was, I think, set by UN resolution in 1990. So, and we are told that we are in the third industrial decade for Africa. And that decade is advocating for building a robust industrial base to help the continent come from, I think we are in the second industrial revolution. Yes, we are still at backward to become maybe to catch up with the global north, which is into fourth industrial revolution. I think climate change presents an opportunity that we will start to initiate a debate on how do we use our cheap natural resources to manpower this industrial base, and at the same time putting it into context that the environment needs preserved, rather than having a blanket embrace of the Western, policies that are saying let's divest overnight without having a concrete plan.
Mimi, I want to conclude with, do you think there will be a better chance for Africans if they inculcated lessons on climate change in the academic syllabus and children are taught this in school? And
Definitely, because I lived in a country where recycling was very important. Where in your household you were taught that, separate your plastics and your compost in your houses. And these basic things that you learn, and these things, they actually contribute to you not stopping climate change, but actually effectively using it in your day-to-day life to actually make the change. So if we educate young people, like Matanda was saying, they implement it in the school and the education system. People actually need to be educated and say, you know what, this is a problem, but we're not going to fix it overnight, but you can fix it in the small things that you do in your life daily. If it means throwing away your plastic and separating it from your compost, do that. If it means maybe not turning on your lights in your house all at once at the same time, do that. So education does play a big part in it.
Let's now get the conclusion from Matanda. Matanda, you're going to conclude, and since you're going to leave this show, you will just tell us something about that, where you're going, and all that.
Okay, thank you very much. It has been a pleasure having this discussion. And of course, it was a big time pleasure hosting this show. This show is one of those few things in my life that I look at as like my baby. And I think that it has a very bright future. The idea was that most of the spaces in this country, despite young people being the majority, are occupied by our seniors. And so we thought it would be important to have a platform that enables young people to share perspectives. And as we have seen so far, even judging from the discussion we just had, the young people are actually able. So the narrative that there are no young people who are informed or who are passionate about things is continuously being debunked by this show. And we hope that through this show, we can be able to mentor ourselves to even occupy bigger platforms. So in conclusion on climate change, I think that what sets human beings apart from the other beings within the universe is capacity to meditate and reflect on the past and then project the future. And so our adaptation, living things usually just adapt naturally, but for human beings, it's possible for us to adapt consciously. And climate change is one of those issues where we are going to prove ourselves, either as people who actually have that capacity, or when maybe we are not as special as we thought, we are just as animists as the other animals. So I call upon everyone, particularly the young people who claim that they are going to live longer, to be able to do the small things in all our spaces, such that we build a more resilient world. Thank you very much. Back to you, Toko.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank the panelists. That has been a very engaging discussion. We've We've said everything that there was to be said, and I just thought that we could have much more time. Unfortunately, we couldn't. Our dear viewers, thank you very much for always tuning into this channel. There's a lot of discussions that happen almost on a daily. So we call upon you to subscribe and always look out for those discussions as they come on. So I hope to meet you next week and we have another discussion with another distinguished panel on a different topic.
Toko,
thank you very much.
Just one more thing. Sorry about this. In this country, it's not very common for people to see their successors. But I must say, judging from this show, I'm very proud. I know that the show has been left in very able hands.
So thank you very much, Matanda. Thank you for trusting me with this. I hope to give it my best. And inshallah, I hope to do it well. And also wish you the best wherever you're going. We know that you serve the country well, and you always remember where you came from. So when you see me asking for bail for my suspect, you should remember where you came from. Thank you very much, and have a good day.